From our studios in Los Angeles, here again is Maria Shriver.
Mobility is freedom. Anyone who relies on a wheelchair to get around is reminded of that every day. That freedom is perhaps even more precious to someone who has spent most of his life walking, only to be paralyzed by a devastating injury. You're about to meet such a man who almost lost hope, but his ingenuity and invention helped him overcome the toughest battle of his life. Here's Margaret Larson.
I've always been competitive, but mostly to myself. I was a professional skier, and I was competing for the national championships in kayaking.
This wasn't just like a little bit of fitness here and there or something that you did as a hobby. This was a big deal in your life.
I was a jock. Yeah, I was a jock.
For many years, Brian Watwood lived for physical challenges. The fastest rapids, the steepest ski slopes, the toughest shots on the tennis court.
But none of that compared to the challenge that began on Labor Day weekend, 1987. Brian was 38, a design engineer, a very active guy when it happened, a moment that forever changed his body and his life.
He and his wife Robbie were headed home after a weekend in the Northern California mountains. Robbie took the car, but Brian, always the jock, hopped on his bike for the 25-mile ride.
I was hooked up with another bicyclist who was in front of me, and we were riding through an intersection where cars would turn off that road.
It started to get dark, dusk time. It was 7:30, thinking, where's Brian?
At that moment, Robbie had no way to know Brian was far from home and wouldn't be back for months. Riding home, he'd been hit head-on by a car, smashing onto the road. Robbie got the terrifying news and raced to the hospital.
It was just horrible, horrible. And I walked in to the emergency room, and I didn't even recognize him. And he couldn't move. Nothing. He couldn't move. And it was just a nightmare.
In fact, their nightmare had just begun. Brian hadn't broken a single bone, but his face was mangled and his spinal cord was badly injured and swollen. He was in and out of surgery and in and out of consciousness for 3 days before doctors could tell him what he was facing.
When I woke up, I was told that I was a quadriplegic, and I was paralyzed from my chin down.
How did you react?
I was terrified. I just figured that if you were a quad, you were going to be a quad forever, and you were never going to move again.
As a champion athlete and a competitor to the bone, Brian Watwood couldn't think of anything worse.
You go from being someone you know to someone you don't know. You can't walk, you can't dress, you can't eat, you can't even go to the bathroom by yourself.
But could that change? Would he ever recover? The doctors had no certain answers, and Brian was slipping into a deep depression.
I was grieving big time for my body.
Was it a temptation just to give up?
There was a point there where I felt like I might want to die.
But with his wife's help, he fought to hang on through several major surgeries. And then suddenly, just 2 weeks after the crash, came a moment he will never forget.
I showed my wife the first movement, and it was this finger right here, and it started to twitch at the end.
I walk in and Brian says, Robbie, I got a new trick. Wait till you see this one. And I mean, we're talking about a guy who couldn't move anything.
That must have seemed like a tremendous victory at that moment.
To me, it was hope, great hope.
That moment was enough to pull him through even more operations, enough to help him attack his grueling physical rehabilitation with the same grit he displayed in athletics.
I realized that I was against a monster. I had to fight this monster, this paralysis. It became a daily war. It was me against it.
And bit by bit, there was progress. 4 months after he'd been rushed to the emergency room, gravely injured, Brian finally made it home, with a metal halo literally screwed into his skull to support his head and neck.
With bolts in my skull, in a god-awful contorted position, and I was happy. I finally got home. I figured then I was going to make it.
It was at that point Brian started a new life out of the hospital, back home with Robbie. But it wouldn't be easy. He'd spend 4 months in that metal halo and torturous hours in daily physical therapy. Brian's spinal cord had not been severed. That meant over time he could regain some feeling in his arms and legs, and over the months he did. But he still couldn't walk, and no one knew if he ever would. So this accomplished athlete faced another challenge, in some ways tougher than all the rest, learning to use a wheelchair.
I always felt so helpless because I couldn't operate the chair.
Must have frustrated you.
It did. Because my hands were not working. I couldn't make those wheels go. So
His hands couldn't grip the wheels, and it was difficult for him to lean forward and propel the chair. Tougher still to stop it. But remember, Brian Watwood was a former design engineer and not one to sit on the sidelines. He had an idea.
I wanted to make the common wheelchair more user-friendly.
With help from some fellow designers, Brian developed a set of levers that fit right on the wheels of his chair. He says the levers are easier to grip and geared to better turn and stop the chair with much less effort. Brian named his invention the Widget and put it on the market. Brian says he's sold nearly 200 widgets so far at about $800 a piece and frequently offers demonstrations.
There you go.
Developing the widget became his mission. And just like physical therapy and his recovery process, it required time and patience.
I've had to sit back and take a deep breath for 10 years over an idea that would help someone, help me, and help thousands of other people do something real simple, move their wheelchair.
It's independence.
It's independence. It's a big difference.
It's been part of your recovery.
It has been my recovery. My style is to make it happen, push it.
When he grabs onto something, he just doesn't give up. It's just the most amazing thing.
It's been 11 years since that fateful bike ride. Brian Watwood made it through his dark days, and he went on to create a device to help not only himself, but other people with disabilities. All this from someone who didn't know if he'd ever walk again, fighting a battle with what he called a monster, his paralysis.
Is our duck still up there at the pool?
Today, Brian Watwood is walking, a hard-fought victory that came slowly over years of physical therapy. He struggles with balance and uses his wheelchair when he needs it. But he knows precisely what it means to be able to move on his own and hopes his invention can be the legacy of his long ordeal.
You're stubborn.
Very stubborn.
Serves you well in this case.
It has served me well, and it'll serve the people well that are going to benefit from the widget. To give that mobility and independence to people is a real neat thing for me.
More than 250,000 people are recovering from spinal cord injuries, and that number grows by 10,000 every year. But not everyone who suffers a spinal cord injury becomes paralyzed. If you'd like more information on the widget or other products designed to help people with disabilities, log on to our website at www.dateline.msnbc.com.